So without further ado, I'll introduce Dan to you, who will start off our first presentation. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So the first presentation today that we're going to do covers Resimion, and it's presented by myself and Patricias Adamo from the University of West of England. What we're going to do is split this session into two parts very quickly, and I'm not going to talk too much about Resimion. Instead, I'm actually going to kind of give a reminder of what Resimion is. We presented on it to this community back at the start of the year, and then allow Patsy to talk through actually using Resimion to create flipped assessments where students are actually creating the scenarios and the problems. Okay, so let me just share my presentation here. So, like I said, we're going to split this into two parts, and the case study we're going to look at today is that Patsy is going to talk about are 90 forensic science students in a human biological systems module and how they actually created their own assessments, quizzes, and problems through the Resimion platform. But just before we do that, let me just kind of give a really quick reminder of what Resimion is, because it kind of underpins everything that Patsy is going to talk about. So a really quick recap, Resimion stands for Research Simulations. It's a product that was created 2 or 3 years ago, starting with haematology students actually in a lecture theatre. Many of them were on their phones, and we wanted to find a way to engage them and start giving them fun, kind of gamified quizzes and problems to work through. And it's ended up becoming a system that is a decision analytics tracking platform. So what that means is it allows students to work through particular problems, to work through particular scenarios, or even just answer simple quizzes, but importantly gives them feedback and adds a bit of fun to the process, or wraps it in an assessment depending on what you want to achieve. Resimion is based on Kolb's experiential learning cycle, so it's giving students feedback in real time, as well as tracking every decision that they make as they go through the process. So for example, they might be walking through a crime scene, they might be working through a very simple quiz, or looking at, say, blood pattern analysis, doing a ballistics analysis, or working through a kind of a multi-day or even a week-spanned case study that is part of an assessment. So Resimion is a web-based or phone-based platform that you design the scenarios and platforms in, and it gets delivered to students either in a lecture with a scoreboard up on the screen, or offline as part of a larger assessment, either summative or formative. So some examples of scenarios: it might be you're doing very simple evidence analysis, it might be you're walking through a full crime scene, right the way from, say, FOA interview, right the way through to preparing for court, filling out particular forms, packaging up particular pieces of evidence, all with timers, points. You may well have evidence quality metrics that you're adding to the scenario as well for students. Or it may well be you're even following lab processes, and Patsy will talk about one of these a bit later, which is, for example, stomach contents analysis as part of forensic science. And there's lots of different functionality in here that students can use as part of the scenario, but under the context of, again, what Patsy is talking about, students can also use it to create their own scenario. So it may well be fingerprint analysis and putting markers on to identify the different characteristics, level 1, 2, or 3 of fingerprints, or it may well be they're annotating images, working through writing full reports that span, maybe even 80 pages, or just very simple text answers. But every decision in Resimion is tracked. And sometimes that will award them points, sometimes it will give them more time. It may well be, for example, you design a problem or a scenario based around a kind of an escape room principle or an adventure type principle, or you just want to run a simple quiz. Resimion facilitates that entire process. And the important thing is, based on the last talk we did, we talked largely about what we had in Resimion, using Bloom's taxonomy here, to talk about the application of knowledge to particular problems. So given a case study, given a crime scene, given a piece of evidence that you need to analyze, you would apply the bottom 3 principles of this triangle and use discrete decision-making, or track discrete decision-making with students, and apply a bit of fun to it. What we then added was the ability to record video responses, so students can actually take their phones outdoors, record crime scenes, and you can use Resimion as a kind of a portfolio product following particular processes. We added that to give more analysis. Why? Why did you make these decisions? You record a video response or write a response that includes the reasoning. And what Pat is going to talk about today is how we've actually gone a step further and flipped it around. So Resimion now allows students to create their own scenarios. Now, that's really important, because actually what it does is it forces students to think not just about how they work through a problem, or even when they create the problem, how they would think through that particular problem that they've created, but it forces them to think about how their peers will think about the problem. And actually, one of the quotes I had from one of the London-based universities talking about Resimion, it forces a student to think about how their peers will interpret the problem or scenario that they're coming up with, which gives them a much deeper level of application and understanding than they would otherwise have. So this is all about flipping the whole process around into what we call co-creation and allowing students to create those scenarios and problems using the Resimion framework. And we now have over 20 universities actually using Resimion. 4 of those universities allowed Resimion to be used to create the scenarios with students. So the assessment was creating the problem or scenario, and UWE is one such organisation that we're going to talk about today. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Patsy to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Dan. I hope everybody can hear me okay. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to give you a lecturer's view of using Resimion to engage students and also to go through how we flip the use of the platform and creation of resims to engage the students to create their own content instead of us lecturers, and how we use this along with student peer review of the sims to create an assessment. So part 1 is, what are we using this for? So there are some main concepts. The first one is to track engagement and support knowledge. So often we run a Resimion as a follow-up to a practical, a tutorial or a lecture. And we use it as a way for students to have their knowledge assessed. And we normally align this with the learning outcomes that we have for that session. We also want to apply context to our learning materials. We use it for a wide range of applications, as Dan said before, like crime scene processing, questioning of an FOA, documentation. For example, we can give students a choice of documents, NG 22B, 21, and they have to choose the correct documentation and fill it in correctly, given a set of CSI notes. We have case studies, MCQs, lab processes, search and recovery, finger mark analysis, and so on and so forth. For example, a level 1 tutorial that I give on the digestive system and the applications of that in forensic science, I provide a case scenario where the students had to determine the most likely PMI based on stomach contents analysis. And we coupled this with some scene information and evidence. So for example, one piece of evidence was a receipt from a food outlet with a time and date stamp and food purchases. So that meant that they had to apply their knowledge of the laboratory processes, testing for fats, carbs and proteins, different types of staining, along with the biological knowledge, which is the structure of the digestive system, food digestion and transit times, to come to an overall conclusion or outcome to determine the PMI of PMI estimation. And we also like to challenge the student. So a more challenging simulation might be that the student is initially presented with an exhibit or a little bit of a case scenario. For example, there might be a hoodie recovered from a suspect of breaking and entering, and perhaps initial examinations, they found a glass fragment in the seam of the clothing, and then they would need to select the correct techniques to analyze it, the GRIM, FTIR, MSP, low power comparison microscopy, and things like that. And we're asking them to choose in the correct order, i.e. using non-destructive processes first. Sometimes we might throw in red herrings, so they have the opportunity to choose incorrect analysis or evidence types. And also we would like to provide practice to them. So students can process multiple crime scenes entirely online with Resimion, and this can enhance their confidence in practical crime scene assessments, especially if access to physical practice is restricted, obviously with COVID at the minute, but even in normal times, we might only have a limited number of visits to a crime scene house due to time and staffing restrictions. So if students are panicking or they want to have bolster their confidence, then they can do these online crime scenes with Resimion. So part 2 is, why are we using it? So we want to validate knowledge on an ongoing basis. So we have weekly assessments. This allows us to monitor students' progress and note any improvement or areas where they're a bit stuck. And the tracking of engagement allows us to see students who might have missed sessions or are falling behind. We can even ask Resimion to send out chase-up emails. So we find that students respond more to emails that say 50% of your cohort have completed this assessment. Please don't forget to play by X time and date. So we find that students respond to that, and they basically just want us to remind them all the time. So we can provide additional content to our learning materials. Obviously, in the programs that we have, we want to teach all the basics, but we might not have the time to teach more of the specialised aspects of forensic science, such as odontology or bite marks. And Resimion gives us a space to do this. So it's a way to introduce novel material alongside the main program of study without it seeming like a chore or a punishment or extra workload for them. So these quick gains can add to the student knowledge. It encourages them to do a bit of further reading, and even better, it doesn't require us as lecturers to go through thousands of slides. And as Dan said, we can use lots of materials, documents, videos, images, anything that makes it fun and not dry. And the students don't feel like it's revision because it's a game. And they keep asking us for more and more, which is great. However, we don't necessarily always have the time to give them as many games as they'd like. Assessments, we use it in a number of ways. Like I said, quizzes, lab studies, ethical dilemmas. We can give them restrictions on time and budget. It's just a very flexible platform, so you can decide how much of the assessment marking is done by the platform itself. You can have it fully automated within Resimion. Resimion also links to things like Blackboard and Moodle, and it can import the grades for you, or you can just have the Resimion and do the marking that you want. So, you know, we just don't have the staff to assess everything in written longhand kind of form. So using Resimion gives us at UWE an opportunity to incorporate new assessment styles in a single platform, really. So, sorry, part 3 is what I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit more detail, which is the student-led assessment. So this gives the students an experience in creating their own Resimions. Allows the students to choose a topic or task of their liking, and it allows the students to provide peer feedback to each other. Although, of course, we as the lecturers are still officially the markers of this assessment, but you'd be surprised about how similar the students' marks are to ours. And in fact, we found the students were actually much harsher than we were. So some students produced exceptional Resimions. I mean, some of them were just way better than even ours. And my colleague who runs the Human Biological Systems module as well, John, he's really tech savvy, and some of theirs were even better than his. So much of the material that they gave back was beyond what we taught them for level 1. So we were really happy about that. So this diagram here is just a decision tree that relates to the analysis of stomach contents example that I gave you here earlier. And you can see that, okay, even I'm not massively tech savvy, but I managed to design one. And you can even see that a very simple simulation can be used as a teaching tool, and you can have it as simple or as complex as you like. So this sim that I did was based on lab processes, and to make it a little bit more challenging, I hid the processes from the students. So the students were given some information, they were told that there was 9 lab processes involved, and they had to search for these lab processes using the information from the tutorial and the search function within Resimion. If you want to be really, really mean, you can make it conditional, so students can't move from one process to another until they found a prerequisite answer. I think this is a bit more useful for our advanced levels of study. So my example here is Human Biological Systems, and this module is our first year module, and it runs across both semesters. Previous feedback on this module before John and I started working on it was that the forensic science students didn't see how knowledge of the human body system and molecular biology was relevant to forensic science. I know, but that was the feedback. They didn't see why they had to learn it. So historically, this has been a module that we've had difficulty engaging the students in, and students have a varied expectation locations and varied backgrounds. Obviously at level 1 we have a lot of the CSI effect and they don't really get the level of science involved. Some students might have an A level in science, some students might have a BTEC. A lot of them didn't even expect science to be part of the course. So with our first year modules we typically have, say, 90 to 100 students. So, sorry, can you hit the next one, please, Dan? And again. Thank you. So tracking and ensuring engagement after weekly lectures or tutorials and practicals. We did this by assigning a proportion of the mark that we had for each assessment to completing a Resimion and whether they got the correct outcome and the decisions that they made. So I would only release the Resimion code during the session. So hopefully most of the students had to come to the live session or at least watch the recording in order to access the code to the Resimion. So in this way, we're providing a mechanism where students can apply their learnt knowledge and understand whether their application is correct or even optimal. So it allows the students to assess their own learning. And we create the game so that the student gets feedback whether their selection was incorrect or correct. So they're always getting feedback about how they're doing. And this allows them to judge for themselves whether they're doing well or where they might need to do a little bit more work. Some of the Resimions we have are practice Resimions, so there's no marking or assessment attached and they can just play it as many times as they want. And this helps to take away the fear of failure. Next slide, please, Dan. So we decided to do a student-created assessment, and this assessment was provided in 4 parts. So part 1, Dan gave the students an overview of the Resimion design tool, and this was formed part of a lecture, and this helps students understand some of the more in-depth features, knowledge base that Resimion provides, and it gave the students an opportunity to ask questions. We also walked through examples of scenarios, quizzes and lab processes that the students had previously had a go at. Part 2. Students were then given the brief and they could select one of 3 options. So they could design a problem-solving case study. This should take the player about 10 to 15 minutes to play, including different actions, different procedures, different data to analyze, and then a selection of hypotheses or outcomes to choose from. They could do a 10-minute recorded mini-teach on a topic relevant to forensic science, but a topic of their choice, and plus 10-question MCQ, or they could do a laboratory procedure test like the stomach contents analysis, where students need to select correct procedures in the correct order. And you can even throw in things like they have to have calculations to solve, like making up solutions, completing a PCR master mix, using a standard curve information to give unknown sample concentrations and things like that. In part 3, we have these, once they'd done their Resimion game, they had to submit it. And Dan created us a central space for the assessment, and basically it was a drag and drop procedure. So they could just drag and drop their game into the Resim space, and once it's submitted, it's locked, and then they can't go back and change it or do anything to it. Part 4 was our peer-reviewed feedback. So Resimion was then used to anonymously and randomly allocate a set number of resims to each student. Each student had to play those resims, allocate a mark, and give constructive feedback. So Resimion automatically allocates the cases, students don't get their own scenario, and it automatically emails all the allocations, so that's great because we don't have to send any manual emails. And then the students uploaded their feedback forms to Blackboard as part of the assessment. And what we did as well is we made it into a fun little competition where the top 5 students got a tiny little prize, and this was based on votes by us lecturers and student votes as well, and they seem to really enjoy that. So I wanted to talk about when I decided to use this idea, what I wanted to gain from it. So in order to create a good Resimion, I knew the students would have to learn the content, because sometimes the best way to learn is to teach. Student revision, obviously to give correct peer-reviewed feedback in that section, then the students have to play the games, and while they're playing the games, they are actively learning and revising. And self-reflective practice, I'm quite big on this. It's a good way to point out to the students once they've engaged in this that actually this is a self-reflective practice, and by playing other students' games, giving constructive feedback, they can apply what they've seen in the other games, good or bad, and apply that to their own learning and future work practices. And the best bit, a repository of Resimions. So using the student collective to create content for future module use. So obviously we have nearly 100 students generating simulations, generating more than John or I could ever do on our own. And some of these student sims are really good, and we're going to keep them on and use them in the module in future years. So our assessment results, and you can see on the right hand side here at the top is just a snapshot of the feedback sheet that we had. We had a very simple feedback sheet and a box at the bottom for their comments. And then, excuse me, you can see underneath the scoring criteria, and that allows us to track what the students are doing in real time, because the different colours, so green with a tick means they've completed it, orange might be that they are in the middle of doing something, and blue is that it's been allocated. So the things that we found from running this assessment were the students loved the assessment, they really enjoyed it, we had a lot of good feedback. They enjoyed being given the freedom to choose a relevant topic. The engagement was really good. Like I said, we could track the students in real time and see how well they were engaging. And students did excellent. Some of the resims were so good, and some of them were actually hilarious. Like students had gone to the time to make fake Facebook profiles for me and John to implicate us in crimes and all of this kind of stuff. They just had a ball with it. It was really good. So what's next? So basically, probably showing my age a bit here. If anybody remembers the Choose Your Own Adventure books, we're going to try and do Choose Your Own Adventure forensic science stories. So students follow a story, they make choices at specific decision points as they go. These choices might move them ahead in the story. They might basically kill them off, they might destroy the evidence, or they might send them back to the beginning. So their selections are going to take them down different branches of the story and affect the outcome, so we can have multiple conclusion outcomes and storylines. And what I'm hoping that this will do is get students to think outside the box by using scenarios that aren't textbook or straightforward. So, for example, with our students, or things that I've actually personally observed, is that students get very stuck when we present them with a scene that's not textbook. So students are taught the theory, they're taught to collect evidence in a certain priority order due to the perishability of that evidence. However, in real life, the priority of collection very much depends on the weight of the evidence that might have in court, or how it's related to the crime, the impact of the physical environment, and the experience of the person. So they get, if you present them with something, they can get literally just stuck and stand there and look at the scene, and they don't know what to do. So the pressure of the assessment really gets to them. So in this way, I've just made up this scenario, so please don't critique me on whether it's accurate or not. So it could be something like they've come to a suspected aggravated burglary and attempted arson scene. As they make their observations, they can see there's a broken window. In the doorway is a doormat, but that appears to have a footwear mark on it, and they can smell petrol. It looks like it's about to rain. What do you process first? And then we can give them some options of what they want to process. So are they going to go for the footwear mark, the possible volatile, or the window? So all of these could potentially be top priority. So when presented with these scenarios, it would probably take them a long time, or they might have a meltdown because it's unexpected and nothing stands out as being the correct thing to do. So there might be one or more correct answers. But what they choose can define the path that they take, and then they can play multiple times, multiple pathways with multiple outcomes. And I think the good thing about this is that we can make them free to play again and again, and they can make different choices without the fear of failure. That's a big thing with students these days, is that they can actually just be paralyzed about making a choice, and if they make the wrong choice. And in this way, it just allows them to, like playing a video game, make mistakes as many times as they like, and then they're just going to learn each time. So we could make a large story. We could have a story that goes from crime scene to lab to court. We could introduce ethical dilemmas, continuity issues. We could have challenges based on bias or opinion. If you want to get really fancy, then you can do things like link scenarios with paramedics, policing, forensic science, and things we're thinking of doing in the future are road traffic collision crime scenes, botany, entomology, and so much more. So I hope that I have given you some insight into the possibilities and applications for using Resimion and flipped learning approaches. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dan and Patsy. That was absolutely brilliant. You've given us loads of ideas. We have got some questions to ask you. So one of the questions is, I'll start with Dan. I don't know if you can hear me. Has Resimion been used by any forensic laboratories or organisations to support training programs for new staff? So that's a question for Dan.
Yeah, so Resimion is being evaluated by a couple. We started to, we got some inquiries about 3 months ago, and now we're kind of taking those inquiries through. And there are a couple of forensic assessment centres and labs using it for training, but it's very early on. So not today, but hopefully in the next couple of months there will be, yes.
That's brilliant. I can see, as a former trainer myself in practice, I can see how this could be used, this platform. So I think that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So I've got a question for Patsy. You gave the criteria for your students to create the assessment. Was there a constriction on time as to how long you gave them to create their assessment for their peers?
Yes, so because it was part of an overall portfolio of assessment, each part of the portfolio, they got a week to create it. So they had a week to create the resim, and the resims had to be about 10 to 15 minutes playtime in length. And then after that, they had a week to do the follow-up and feedback. So, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Are you able, would you be willing to share your assessment brief as a resource for the viewers of our video? We have many people choose to look at our videos after our actual event, and I think they would really appreciate seeing an outline of your assessment and the approach that you took, if that's of interest to yourself, and perhaps liaising with other institutions as well.
Yeah, I'm up for doing that. I will obviously have to check with the powers that be about how much I can give away or not give away. But yeah, that's definitely something I could ask about.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Because you've built up a repository at your institution, I wondered if it's a possibility for other institutions that have also created resources in Resimion. Is that of interest to yourself and your students, linking up perhaps co-creation of institutions?
So if I could answer that one, Patsy, we actually have institutions sharing already now. So one of the things that Resimion gives for customers is the ability to network, and we have cross-institutional sharing going on. Say biomedical science, there's some sharing going on. Forensics, there's sharing going on as well. So that happens an incredible amount. So we have public scenarios that are available to everybody. We have privately shared between institutions, and you can choose which institutions or individuals in those institutions you share with. And then obviously you have private scenarios that are just for your institution. And you're able to select which scenarios you do what with, but that is happening today.
That's brilliant, thank you. And Patsy, a final question for yourself. You mentioned the fear of failure concept within students, and I think we can all relate to that situation with students. And how can you take your scenarios forward to help student well-being and their perception of these activities? Has it helped your students in that respect?
Yes, definitely it has helped them, because it's given them an opportunity to practice and to have an understanding of the processes that are involved, and allows them to make mistakes without, you know what it's like if you've got a lecturer or somebody like your boss or something standing over your shoulder watching you do something, you just like, oh, you clam up and you don't know what to do. And even if you did know what to do, sometimes you just get like a brain freeze and you can't do it. And obviously with this year, we've been really restricted with our practicals and what we can do, and we weren't allowed to use our crime scene house for ages. And we were like, how can we get them to understand the processes and walk through it without giving them a physical crime scene? And using Resimion is one way they can do that, because we can force them to go through the steps if we want. So if they're just learning, we can make them do a risk assessment. We can give them a scenario of an FOA. We can, you know, make them do prioritization and say why and do all of that kind of thing. And obviously in advanced years, we just give them less directives and allow them to kind of free wheel with it a bit. But students just keep asking for more and more practice and more backup, which we don't have the time to give. Like, we'd love to give it, but we've got, like, most students think that we only teach their module and they don't realize we've got like 500 people that we're trying to look after. So it's a way of giving it's a way of managing expectations, giving value for money, but also not having a huge impact on us, because once we've made it, then you can just play it over and over again, and it's just created content then, and we found it very useful.
Absolutely. Ian's put a comment in the Q&A. Really good presentation. Gamification, which is a new concept in pedagogy in HE, very much recognises the freedom to fail, and that can overcome barriers normally that inhibits people's perception to learning. And he's put a question here. I think you've answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Therefore, how do you assess balancing the tension between getting it right and learning from the incorrect decisions?
Okay, so the way that we do it is we have what I call practice scenarios, which are open. So they're the same concept or the same principle with maybe a different story. And then we have the assessment scenarios as well. So the assessment scenarios you can only play once, and you make your choices and you're assessed on the decisions and the outcomes of the assessment ones, but we give them practices to begin with, and it's not that it's a million miles away. And just to flag up as well, just in case anybody's interested, Resimion has really good accessibility. So if any students have a special learning difficulty, or another thing that we found is obviously some of our foreign language speaking students whose English is not their first language, you know, they can play on the practice Resimions as well, get used to the words, the language and the way things are. So it's just allows people to play without worrying about, you know, what the lecturers are going to say or how they're going to be marked. And then they can take this forward to the actual assessed scenarios.
I think it's a fantastic resource platform, and the fact that you're going to now move to interdisciplinary, more complex investigations, I can only see the benefit in that as a practitioner, and I can see how, regarding the training possibilities for police forces and forensic laboratories, you know, I can see how this would start training modules, and then you move on to the competency test, and maybe even set aside proficiency tests as well. So I think it's an excellent resource. So thank you both for an amazing presentation.